One of the big themes that emerged, actually, I guess this really came to me, I think, when Ed Glazer gave the talk yesterday, sort of designing markets under weak institutions. So I don't necessarily mean in a developing country where there are weak institutions, not necessarily like that, but in places where it's very, very hard to set up a market. How do we do this? What do we do when we have incomplete contracts? So, when Al was talking about surrogacy, how do we set up these international markets? Will was talking about the refugee issues. How do we kind of process and get refugees on board? Of course, Ashok's point about coffee growers, right? I mean, it can be very difficult to set up a good insurance system for these guys. And in fact, actually, even when Rob was talking about housing, I was thinking it's the same thing. Now, you're in a situation with a lot of homeless people. They're very difficult to track. It's hard to get data. It's hard to build a market sometimes like this. So this is one of the themes. Now, the other one, which at first I thought we would get a lot of sort of scarce information issues, right? So we'd like to have one of the things that a market can solve is sort of aggregate, pull together this kind of bits of information, and maybe the information wasn't there. We build system to pull the information together. And in some sense, even Canis's paper was about this, right? The food banks have their private information, and once you build the system right, the prices end up revealing that extra information in the market. But of course, then we had papers about abundant information. We had too much information, and we didn't know almost what to do with it. So, of course, the entire session on the digital economy was about how do we deal with privacy and so on. And in fact, Katarina made this point is, now we're living in this sort of age where we have so much of this data, we almost have no excuse to just write theoretical models. We have to go beyond that and sort of evaluate programs. So, the session with Judd, Vince, and Katarina, it was very data intensive, and it's nice to know that now we can start building markets not just from our imagination and sort of projecting them, but actually starting with the data and saying, very careful data, understanding already a lot about preference, and then thinking how we can build a market around this. And the other thing that sort of emerged, I think, throughout the 2 days is these links across different designed and maybe not quite so designed markets. So I think the last session made this very obvious, right? We're linking a decision about going to college and with another decision, about your labor outcomes perhaps, or your investment and so on. And so when I guess it started when Parag started talking about housing and schooling in the same model. And of course, a lot of these models have existed in the past, but often I think we as market designers sort of had a fairly narrow view. We would take a particular narrow problem. And I think what's been great here is that we started seeing links across from schooling to housing to, say, teacher allocation and so on. And that's been good. So I think one of the agendas that we can push forward is actually started linking those individual models across. And as Parag pointed out, it can be hard to solve something that has 2 towns rather than just one. But we obviously going to go in that direction. So these have been the themes. Now let me sort of give you an idea of how Scott and I are thinking about writing our introduction, and any feedback would be very welcome. And we sort of think we should structure this in sort of around, if you like, 3 dyads, and then I'll tell you why they're not really dyads. One of them is sort of an idea of, it's a sort of a thing of 2. 2. Rather than 3, which would be a triad. One issue that I think sort of came across is the distinction between narrow versus sort of broad economic design. As I just said, for a lot of the problems we've had in the past to build beautiful models and make sure they're implemented and they be clean, we'd look very narrowly at a very small problem and work very hard at perfecting it and making it beautiful, and as Rob said, building that strategy-proof, stable, it's a mechanism, and that would work really well, and we'd learn a lot about these systems. And once we've sort of, if you like, perfected them and understood so much about them, I think here we're now talking about much broader economic design issues. How can we link design markets to not necessarily design markets? Which brings me to the second point, actually. A lot of the economic design stuff that we've talked about here is not to do necessarily with marketplace design. So despite the name of the conference, there were plenty of things that we've had which were not really marketplace design at all. So even Parag's paper, Parag, the archetypal market designer, was actually presenting a paper that was not as much about traditional market design at all, but Sometimes it is. Sometimes we want to just design a particular marketplace or indeed create something much narrower. And so finally, the thing that we want to think about is which inequality have we been tackling? So irrespective of whether it's a narrow or a broad issue of economic design, whether it's marketplace or non-marketplace, which inequality are we talking about? Are we talking about inequality within a particular system that we're looking at or designing? Or is it that this system itself is trying to alleviate the broader inequality that we might be concerned about? And, you know, let's take Canis's paper. He was really worried about the inequality issue that arose explicitly within his system, right? And he went out and he sort of tried to tackle this with his design. But it doesn't have to be like this. So with the design interventions and affirmative action that we think about, of course, the inequality within the system matters, but the broader, if you like, this broad economic design is also the inequality that is being alleviated in society by affirmative action also matters. So I'm hoping that we can mention these things, or you indeed can mention these things in your talk. So maybe this is a helpful framework to think about what we've talked about over the last 2 days. And if you have any other ideas or dimensions on which how we should structure our thinking, please email us or let us know. And really, they're not really dyads. So don't think about it as binary. Think about it like gender. It's a continuum. Okay, so in the same way as gender is a continuum, let me just use that opportunity to say this. You might say that actually narrow versus broad economic design is not actually either one or the other. So the way I would think about, Judd's paper, I don't really know which. I think it fits somewhere in the middle. It is somewhere between, looking at a fairly narrow intervention, but then actually thinking, how can I use this to design broader programs? And it's the same with marketplace versus non-marketplace. If we take an example of Kate's paper, it's not clear whether it fits into one particular box. She's looking at a marketplace, which is the marketplace for health services, but the interventions she's thinking about are not necessarily to do with a redesign. They're to do with other instruments they're using within the marketplace. So think about these dimensions, these spectra, these issues, and let us know about the ones.